He doubted everything: reality, the body, the senses, even mathematics. But it was in that radical doubt that he discovered the only certainty possible. I think, therefore I am. René Descartes wasn't just a philosopher. He was the architect of modern reason, the man who dared to break with centuries of tradition to rebuild knowledge from solid foundations. In this video, you'll discover the full story and the groundbreaking ideas that gave birth to rationalism, shaped science, challenged religion, and forever changed the way we think. If you've ever wondered what can truly be known for certain, get ready. Welcome to the world of René Descartes. René Descartes was born in 1596 in La Haye, in the Kingdom of France, a Europe deeply marked by intellectual, religious, and scientific upheaval. His life unfolded at a pivotal moment in Western history, when the old medieval world was collapsing under the weight of its own contradictions, while a new worldview began to emerge, one defined by reason, science, and the autonomy of thought. To truly understand Descartes' philosophy, we can't look at his ideas in isolation. We have to see them as a response to the anxieties of his time. The Europe in which he lived was in turmoil, a continent torn by religious wars and ideological conflicts, yet eager for new ways to understand nature, knowledge, and humanity's place in the cosmos. In the 16th and 17th centuries, Europe became the stage for brutal clashes between Catholics and Protestants. The Protestant Reformation, started by Martin Luther in 1517, had shaken the authority of the Catholic Church, for centuries the main gatekeeper of knowledge, morality, and truth. In response, the Counter-Reformation tried to restore Catholic orthodoxy, often through force. In that environment, religion was no longer just a matter of faith. It became a matter of political, social, and even military identity. The 30 Years' War, from 1618 to 1648, the most devastating conflict of the era, symbolized that fragmentation. It not only destroyed large parts of Europe, but also exposed the failure of a continent once united by faith. By the war's end, more than 8 million people were dead, and the continent bore the scars of fanaticism, intolerance, and dogmatism. Descartes was born right in the middle of this world. He grew up under the shadow of a violent religiosity that often placed dogma above reason, in a world where truth was imposed by power. Whether from the church or the state, rational thought struggled to breathe. Doubt, long seen as a sin, was beginning to be seen as a virtue. And it was precisely this search for a truth independent of imposed faith, a certainty not dependent on religious authority or tradition, that would become Descartes' great philosophical mission. During the Middle Ages, European thought was dominated by scholasticism, a philosophical theological tradition that tried to reconcile Christian faith with Aristotelian reason. Thinkers like Thomas Aquinas sought to prove the truths of faith through reason, believing that revelation and logic worked hand in hand. But by the early 17th century, this way of thinking was wearing thin. Scholasticism was criticized for being overly technical, reliant on ancient texts, and disconnected from the new scientific discoveries. University students felt they were learning empty formulas rather than living truths. Thought itself was beginning to break free from tradition's grip. Descartes represented that break. He studied at Jesuit schools, where he received a solid scholastic education, but, as he later wrote in Discourse on the Method, he left those institutions with more doubts than certainties. The medieval system could no longer answer the great questions of the time. Blind faith in the authority of the ancients was no longer enough. It was time to start over, to doubt everything, not like a desperate skeptic, but like a thinker searching for a solid foundation upon which to rebuild the house of knowledge. This was the birth of modern rationalism, and Descartes was its founding figure. Another key element of Descartes' context was the rise of modern science. While scholasticism viewed the universe as a divine creation filled with spiritual purpose, the new scientists began to see nature as measurable, governed by mathematical laws. Copernicus, Kepler, Galileo, and Newton were inaugurating a new way of understanding the cosmos, not as a theatre of salvation, but as a machine that could be studied, understood, and even controlled. The the universe stopped being interpreted symbolically and began being described mathematically. Galileo, in particular, deeply influenced Descartes. His use of the experimental method, his focus on natural laws, and his rejection of explanations based on authority all shaped Descartes' thinking. For him, human reason should work with the same precision as mathematics, and reality should be approached with clarity and distinction, free of ambiguity. Modern science wasn't just a new way to know the world. It was a new way to live. It promised intellectual autonomy, freedom from tradition, and mastery over nature. Descartes saw in it the opportunity to rebuild not just philosophy, but the entire structure of human knowledge. At that time, it wasn't only religion that was being questioned, it was authority itself. The authority of the church, of kings, of universities, and even of family traditions was no longer accepted without challenge. The 17th century was a time of uncertainty, instability, and radical change. The ancient pillars of the medieval world were crumbling. Truth was no longer something handed down from generation to generation. It had to be discovered, conquered by individual reason. And that's when the figure of the modern thinker appeared. An autonomous being who thinks for himself, doubts, investigates, and seeks certainty through his own means. Descartes became the symbol of this new kind of thinker. He embodied the transition from a world based on faith and tradition to one grounded in reason and methodical doubt. The very act of thinking became the foundation of existence, and that was only possible because his time demanded a new response to a new crisis. Living through the collapse of medieval certainties was not easy. In a world fragmented by war, divided by religion, and transformed by science, what could still be considered true? Descartes answered that question with a radical proposal: to doubt everything until finding a point absolutely beyond doubt, and from there, to rebuild all knowledge with rigor and method. His philosophy was born as a response to a world without foundations. He didn't run from the crisis. He dove into it to find solid ground in reason. As he wrote in Discourse on the Method, "Good sense is the best distributed thing in the world, for everyone thinks himself so well endowed with it that even those who are the hardest to please in everything else do not usually desire more of it than they already have." That line captures Descartes' confidence in reason, not an abstract, distant reason, but one that belongs to everyone and can guide us even through the darkest times. Before becoming the father of modern rationalism, René Descartes was, like many young men of his era, a student shaped by rigid traditional education. His intellectual journey began with a solid Jesuit upbringing, deeply rooted in Aristotelian thought and the scholastic method. Yet, it was from that very foundation that he would eventually break away to create something new, a new way of thinking, questioning, and understanding the world. And to understand that break, we must first understand what shaped him. At 8 years old, Descartes was sent to the prestigious Jesuit College of La Flèche, known for its academic excellence. He stayed there for about 7 years, immersed in an environment that blended Christian theology with Aristotelian logic. The Jesuits had a refined teaching method focused on forming disciplined, articulate, and rational minds. The goal wasn't just to pass on knowledge, but to train students to argue clearly, defend ideas logically, and develop structured thinking. This rhetorical and logical discipline left a lasting mark on Descartes, giving him the intellectual tools he would later refine. Yet, despite his early admiration, Descartes soon felt that this education didn't lead to truth, only to mastery of an outdated system. In Discourse on the Method, he wrote, "So when I had finished the entire course of study, I found myself entangled in so many doubts and errors that it seemed to me I had gained no profit from my attempts to learn, except the realization of my growing ignorance." That dissatisfaction became his turning point. Descartes wanted more than to repeat ancient ideas. He wanted to ground knowledge in something absolutely certain, free from inherited traditions and arbitrary opinions. For centuries, Aristotle had reigned supreme in European universities. His philosophy, adapted to Christianity by Thomas Aquinas, provided the foundation for cosmology, logic, physics, and ethics. At Jesuit schools, Aristotelian doctrine was taught with precision. Concepts like syllogistic logic, the four causes, and teleology, the idea that everything in nature has a purpose, formed the mental framework of the time. The world was seen as an ordered organism where every being had its natural place and function. However, as new scientific discoveries emerged, such as the planetary movements described by Copernicus, Kepler, and Galileo, that Aristotelian worldview began to crumble. The heavens were not immutable, as Aristotle claimed. The earth was not the center of the cosmos. Qualitative explanations no longer satisfied the new spirit of science. Descartes saw that Aristotelian philosophy belonged to a world that no longer existed, and it was precisely against that tradition, the very one that had educated him, that he chose to rebel. Not out of rejection, but out of the realization that knowledge needed a total reconstruction, secure, rational, and free from dogma. If Descartes broke with Aristotle, he was deeply inspired by Galileo Galilei. The Italian scientist embodied the new science, experimental, mathematical, and critical of tradition. While the scholastics argued over abstract causes, Galileo pointed his telescope at the heavens and found moons orbiting Jupiter, sunspots, and mountains on the moon, observations unthinkable in the old paradigm. Galileo didn't just observe, he thought boldly. He rejected appeals to authority and argued that nature must be read like a book written in the language of mathematics. As he famously said, philosophy is written in this grand book, the universe, which stands continually open to our gaze. But it cannot be understood unless one first learns to comprehend the language and to read the characters in which it is written. It is written in mathematical language. That vision deeply shaped Descartes. Like Galileo, he believed that the physical world could be described with clarity and precision, without mystical or vague notions. Instead of the hidden qualities of the scholastics, he focused on measurable concepts, quantity, extension, and motion. But Descartes wanted to go even further. He wasn't content with experiments or empirical observations. His ambition was to find a universal method, a guide for human thought across every field of knowledge. While Galileo was a scientist, Descartes sought to be a founder of a philosophy built on reason as humanity's most reliable tool. Shaped by his dissatisfaction with Jesuit education, the decline of Aristotelianism, and the rise of modern science, Descartes concluded that knowledge needed a new beginning. Not a partial reform, but a complete restart, tearing down the old house to rebuild it from the ground up. That revolutionary impulse is clear in his Discourse on the Method, 1637, where he presents the four principles of reason: evidence, analysis, synthesis, and enumeration. With them, Descartes aimed to ensure that no idea would be accepted without clarity, that problems would be broken down, rebuilt logically, and verified carefully. This proposal was born from his recognition that ancient influences could no longer explain the modern world. Scholasticism was exhausted, Aristotle outdated, and faith could no longer serve as the foundation of knowledge. It was time to trust reason, ordered, methodical, and critical reason. It's important to note that Descartes wasn't a destroyer of tradition. He was a rebuilder. Unlike radical skeptics who claimed nothing could be known, Descartes believed certainty was possible, as long as it began from an absolutely secure foundation. He acknowledged the value of his studies, Aristotle's influence, and Galileo's brilliance. But his response was that of a man aware of his era's crisis, one unwilling to settle for inherited half-truths. He wanted to think for himself, and more than that, to teach humanity to think freely, rigorously, and confidently. Descartes did not appear out of nowhere. He was the product of a transitional age, educated by tradition, yet brave enough to doubt everything he had learned. And it was that courage, the willingness to break from the old to build the new, that made him a turning point in the history of philosophy. His first steps were taken between faith and reason, between Aristotle and Galileo, between the Jesuits and modern science. But his legacy goes far beyond that. He opened a new era in which the human mind became the center and the ultimate measure of truth. To understand the revolution René Descartes brought to Western thought, we have to start with a fundamental gesture: his rejection of the old methods of teaching and inquiry. Descartes wasn't just a brilliant philosopher, he was a reformer of reason, someone who dared to question centuries of intellectual tradition. He lived during a time of deep change, as we've already seen, an age when religious wars were tearing Europe apart and science was beginning to free itself from the grip of authority and dogmatic faith. In that context, the educational system inherited from the Middle Ages looked increasingly outdated, and Descartes had no fear of saying that out loud. In his groundbreaking work Discourse on the Method, 1637, Descartes begins with something deeply human: the confession of a disappointed young student. After years of studying at a Jesuit college, one of the most prestigious in France, he realized that he had gathered much knowledge but little wisdom. As soon as I had completed the entire course of study, I found myself entangled in so many doubts and errors that it seemed to me I had gained no profit from my attempts to learn, except the realization of my growing ignorance. That statement is powerful. It reveals not just personal frustration, but a clear perception that the education of his time produced no real certainty. Knowledge was more decorative than true. Students learned to quote ancient authors, repeat classic formulas, and use abstract logic. But they didn't actually know how to discover truth. It was a knowledge based on authority, not investigation, on repetition, not discovery. Descartes criticized the way people were taught what to think, but not how to think. During the Middle Ages, philosophical and scientific education was dominated by almost blind reverence for the great thinkers of the past, especially Aristotle. The scholastic model, which combined formal logic, religious dogma, and fixed references, valued the authority of ancient texts above all else. In practice, that meant an idea was considered true not because it was rationally demonstrated, but because it agreed with Aristotle, St. Augustine, or some other revered master. The goal was fidelity to tradition, not intellectual freedom. Descartes saw that this method stifled genuine thought. He didn't deny the value of the ancients, but he criticized the blind submission to them. Instead of searching for truth, scholars were just trying to justify what older authorities had already said. It is better not to think about seeking truth at all than to do so without method. Descartes' criticism goes straight to the heart of the problem. Without a proper method, the human mind gets lost in a maze of arguments, traditions, and appearances. What was missing, he said, was a clear, orderly, and rational path. Something that could lead the mind out of confusion and towards solid truth. Another key factor behind his rejection of the old methods was the growing crisis of knowledge itself. On one side stood the dogmatism of scholasticism, an overconfidence in eternal truths that often didn't hold up in practice. On the other side was a rising skepticism that questioned whether anything could truly be known at all. This tension between blind dogma and total doubt was unsustainable. If everything could be doubted, knowledge was impossible. But if everything had to be accepted by faith or authority, then freedom of thought was gone. Descartes rejected both extremes. He sought a middle ground, a kind of doubt that didn't destroy knowledge but made it stronger. He wanted a form of criticism that didn't end in despair, but in clarity. So his first move was radical, to break from the old way. He said it was necessary to tear everything down to the foundations and rebuild from scratch. The metaphor of rebuilding appears often in his writing. The old system of knowledge was like a crumbling house. It had to be reconstructed with solid foundations. His rejection of the old was not destructive, but creative. Descartes admired the progress of mathematics, especially geometry, and saw in it the clarity and precision philosophy lacked. He wanted to apply that same mathematical rigor to all areas of knowledge. Inspired by that geometric precision, he conceived the idea of a universal method, a way to guide human reason in every field, from science to ethics, from metaphysics to medicine. Rejecting the old ways opened the door for something new, a way of thinking based on ordered reasoning, where every step is justified, clear, and logically necessary. This new attitude toward knowledge became one of the hallmarks of modern thought. Reason, once subordinate to faith, now took center stage. Thinking was no longer about submission to authority, but about critical independence. Descartes' proposal was, at its core, liberating. He invited people to think for themselves, to stop depending on masters and pre-made systems, to question what they had been taught, even if it meant facing uncertainty. After all, the pursuit of truth requires courage. In truth, Descartes' act of rejection wasn't just intellectual. It was existential. It was the stance of someone who refused to live on borrowed certainties, who sought authenticity, and who wanted to walk his own path. That spirit would go on to inspire generations of thinkers after him, from Kant to Husserl, from Spinoza to Sartre. Descartes created the image of the modern thinker, someone who, even when faced with doubt and chaos, chooses reason as their compass. In order to reform the world and others, it is better that each one begin by reforming himself. That sentence captures the depth of his revolution. Descartes didn't just want to reform knowledge, he wanted to reform the thinking subject itself. To do that, he had to leave behind old methods, unclear paths, and all truths that couldn't stand the test of reason. Rejecting the old methods wasn't a minor detail. It was the starting point of his entire philosophy. It was the spark that ignited a new way of thinking. Descartes knew that to move forward, he first had to break free. That break marks the birth of modern philosophy. After Descartes, truth was no longer sought in external authorities, but within human reason itself. Inquiry became personal, methodical, and rigorous. And that changed everything. Instead of passively accepting the world, the thinker began to question, to doubt, to seek foundations. And that attitude defined an entire philosophical era, one of autonomy, rationality, and the search for solid grounds. After rejecting the old philosophical and scientific methods, Descartes understood that to reach firm and undeniable truths, he needed to build a new path for thought, a secure, rational, and rigorous method that could lead the human mind toward true knowledge, free from illusions, uncertainty, and dogma. That's the spirit behind his Discourse on the Method, 1637, where he introduces 4 fundamental rules, the pillars of his philosophy. Each one was designed as a cure for confused thinking and as a tool to build clear, critical, and progressive reasoning. These 4 principles, evidence, analysis, synthesis, and enumeration, are more than just technical steps. They represent a whole attitude toward life and knowledge. They are an invitation to think clearly, calmly, and systematically. Let's explore each one. 1. Evidence. Never accept anything as true without clear and distinct certainty. The first rule of the Cartesian method sets the tone. Never accept anything as true unless it is evidently true. That is, avoid haste and prejudice, and include nothing in my judgments except what presents itself so clearly and distinctly to my mind that I have no reason to doubt it. Here, Descartes touches the very core of his philosophy. He realized that most human errors come from rushing to judgment, from accepting as true what only seems to be true. That happens when we trust our senses, which often deceive us, or when we repeat ideas we don't fully understand, just because an authority said them. The rule of evidence demands rigor. We should only accept as true what the mind perceives with complete clarity, what cannot be doubted. Truth isn't what appears to be true, it's what reason grasps as undeniable. This is a demanding standard, but that's what makes it powerful. By requiring every idea to be clear and distinct, Descartes sets a high bar for intellectual honesty, patience, and depth. Evidence here doesn't mean what we see with our eyes, but what reason sees with certainty. The phrase, "I think, therefore I am," Cogito, ergo sum, is the clearest example of that kind of evidence. 2. Analysis. Break every problem into as many parts as possible. The second rule is the rule of analysis. Divide each of the difficulties I examine into as many parts as possible and as necessary to resolve them better. This shows Descartes' commitment to clarity in reasoning. Many problems seem impossible simply because we try to handle them as a whole, without breaking them down. Analysis is the art of decomposition, taking apart the complex to understand its structure. Like a mechanic disassembling an engine, we can understand better by examining the smaller pieces. Once we solve the parts, we can understand the whole. This rule was inspired by geometry, where complex problems are solved by reducing them to simple axioms. For Descartes, the same logic should apply to all knowledge. Complexity is not to be feared. It just needs to be broken down systematically. Analysis prevents confusion and chaos in thinking. To think well is to think in order. And analysis is the first step toward that order. 3. Synthesis. Proceed step by step, from the simple to the complex. Once problems are divided, we must rebuild our reasoning in the right order. That's the rule of synthesis. Conduct my thoughts in order, beginning with the simplest and easiest things to know, and gradually rising, as if by steps, to knowledge of the more complex. This ensures that thought progresses logically, step by step. Instead of starting from vague or complicated ideas, Descartes insists on beginning with what is most evident, then advancing carefully toward what is uncertain. The image of steps is intentional. Thought must rise gradually, each idea building upon the previous one. This avoids leaps of logic, hasty conclusions, and weak foundations. This process demands patience and discipline. It's like building a bridge between what we know and what we don't. For Descartes, thinking is a craft, not a chaos. 4. Enumeration. Review everything completely so nothing is left out. The fourth and final rule completes the method. Make complete enumerations and general reviews so that I am certain to have omitted nothing. This emphasizes careful verification. Every step must be reviewed so that no detail is forgotten and no error remains. Enumeration ensures thoroughness and protects against oversight. It's the same spirit behind modern science. Every experiment must be tested, reviewed, and confirmed. For Descartes, thought itself must follow the same rigor, not just constructing arguments, but checking them. This rule also shows the humility of the true philosopher. Unlike the dogmatist, who stops at half-truths, Descartes demands full examination and continuous attention. The Cartesian method is more than logic. It's a discipline of the mind, an ethics of thought. These four principles, evidence, analysis, synthesis, and enumeration, form the backbone of Descartes' method. They weren't designed only for philosophy, but for every kind of knowledge. They are a true art of thinking well, a guide for anyone who wants to escape confusion, blind belief, and shallow thinking. More than that, they sparked a silent revolution. With them, Descartes turned philosophy into an active, practical tool. Reason was no longer passive contemplation, but a force that investigates, organizes, and rebuilds the world. Method is the order and arrangement of things through which, by investigating the unknown, we arrive at knowledge. Rules for the direction of the mind. The impact of the Cartesian method was enormous. It reshaped philosophy, influenced mathematics, physics, and medicine, and opened the door to modern thought itself. By teaching humanity how to think, not just what to think, Descartes changed everything. That, perhaps, is his greatest lesson. At first glance, doubt might seem like an act of denial, a retreat, a refusal to believe in anything. But for René Descartes, doubting was the first courageous step towards certainty. His doubt wasn't despair. It was a method, and its goal wasn't to destroy knowledge, but to rebuild it on a foundation that was solid, clear, and unshakable. At the heart of his philosophical project lies what he called methodical doubt, a radical way of questioning everything that had been accepted as true, the senses, traditions, opinions, and untested reasoning. But unlike the skeptics who doubt forever, Descartes doubts only to find one thing that cannot be doubted. a truth so undeniable that no illusion could shake it. For some time now, I have realized that, from my earliest youth, I have accepted many false opinions as true, and that what I afterward built on such shaky foundations could only be highly doubtful and uncertain. Meditations on First Philosophy, First Meditation. This realization led Descartes to take a bold step, to suspend every belief that contained even the slightest reason for doubt, no matter how familiar, deep-rooted, or obvious it might seem. And this is where his method begins. To distrust everything, not out of nihilism, but as a strategy to uncover what can truly withstand doubt. It's easy to mistake Cartesian doubt for philosophical skepticism, but Descartes made it clear from the beginning. He was not a skeptic. Ancient skeptics, like the Pyrrhonists, doubted everything as a permanent stance. For them, certainty was impossible, and wisdom meant suspending judgment forever. Descartes, on the other hand, used doubt only as a means to reach certainty. His doubt was temporary, deliberate, and methodical, a tool, not an endpoint. He doubted in order to find something absolutely indubitable, even if it was just one truth. This marked a turning point in modern philosophy. Until then, knowledge was thought to come from tradition, the senses, or the authority of ancient masters. Descartes decided to start from zero. He wanted a truth that depended on nothing but itself, something that could not be denied under any condition. I will apply myself earnestly and freely to the general destruction of all my former opinions. Meditations on First Philosophy, First Meditation. This wasn't a destructive gesture. It was liberating. Descartes wanted to clear away doubtful beliefs so he could rebuild knowledge, like tearing down an old house to lay a stronger foundation. To apply his method, he began with a daring move, to question all his beliefs, not just a few. He wanted to reach the very roots of knowledge. His first target was the senses. How often do they deceive us? A stick dipped in water looks bent. Distant objects look small. Mirages fool the eye. Dreams feel real. So how can we trust our senses as a foundation for truth? All that I have accepted up to now as most true I have learned from or through the senses. Yet I have sometimes found them deceptive, and it is wise never to trust completely those who have deceived us even once. Meditations on First Philosophy, First Meditation. Descartes wasn't rejecting the senses entirely, only refusing to take them as a reliable source of certainty. His point was simple. If something has deceived us before, it can't serve as the foundation of truth. The dream argument, can we trust reality? But Descartes goes further. Even if our senses were perfect, how can we be sure that the world around us really exists? He introduces the dream argument. We all know what it's like to dream so vividly that it feels real, to see, feel, and act as though awake. And yet, when we wake up, we realize it was all an illusion. How can I distinguish the state of waking from that of sleep? Are there any sure signs by which I can tell one from the other? Meditations on First Philosophy, First Meditation. If dreams can imitate reality so well, how do we know that what we call reality isn't just another dream? The thought is unsettling, but that's exactly the point. Descartes isn't claiming we are dreaming, only that we have no certain way to prove we're not. That uncertainty alone is enough to shake the reliability of sensory experience. The doubt of reason. What if even math deceives us? After questioning the senses and the external world, Descartes turns to something seemingly untouchable, reason itself. Surely 2 plus 2 coins summon 4 is always true, right? Surely geometry and arithmetic are beyond doubt. At first, yes, even if the senses fail, math seems indestructible. But then Descartes imagines something even more radical. What if an all-powerful force were deceiving him, even in his most logical thoughts? This is the famous idea of the evil genius, a being so powerful and cunning that it could manipulate all his perceptions, memories, and reasoning, making falsehoods seem true. I will suppose, then, that not God, who is supremely good, but some malicious demon of the utmost power and cunning has employed all his energies in deceiving me. Meditations on First Philosophy, First Meditation. This isn't literal. Descartes didn't believe in a real demon. It's a philosophical experiment, the ultimate test of certainty. If even math could be doubted under this scenario, then nothing else could be taken for granted. At this extreme point, when everything seems uncertain, Descartes makes his most important discovery. In the middle of all this doubt, one truth remains undeniable. If he is doubting, he must be thinking. And if he is thinking, then he must exist as a thinking being. But immediately, as I tried to think that everything was false, I found that I, who was thinking this, must necessarily exist. And noting that this truth, I think therefore I am, was so firm and so certain that no extravagant supposition of the skeptics could overthrow it, I decided that I could accept it as the first principle of the philosophy I was seeking. 1. Meditations on First Philosophy, Second Meditation. This is the birth of the Cogito. Cogito, ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. The first absolute certainty, the one truth that even an evil genius could not erase. Doubt, which seemed to destroy everything, becomes the very path to truth. Like fire purifying gold, doubt burns away falsehood and leaves behind only what is indestructible, the self that thinks, I am, I exist. This is necessarily true whenever it is stated by me or conceived in my mind. Meditations on First Philosophy, Second Meditation. Descartes' doubt isn't just a logical procedure, it's an act of intellectual freedom. It's the refusal to accept anything as true unless it withstands reason. It's the belief that the human mind can find its own path without depending on dogma or tradition. This was revolutionary. Descartes ushered in the modern era of philosophy with a simple but powerful act: to doubt in order to think in order to exist, and to exist in order to know. His examples of doubt, the senses, the dream, the evil genius, aren't just curiosities, they are exercises in critical thinking. They remind us not to accept truths without examining them. They challenge us to question what we believe to be obvious and to recognize that knowledge must rest on solid ground. In this sense, Cartesian doubt is an act of courage. The choice to think independently, even when it means facing uncertainty. It's a leap into the unknown, guided only by reason. And from that silence, from the emptiness left after all the old certainties fall, emerges the first undeniable truth, I think. And with that, everything begins again. In the history of philosophy, few moments are as powerful as the one when René Descartes, after subjecting all his beliefs to the most radical doubt, finds one point that resists all uncertainty. Cogito, ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. This isn't just a clever phrase, it's a rebirth of the self, the moment from which modern philosophy begins to take shape. For the first time, the thinking self becomes the foundation of all knowledge, and it's this rediscovery of the I, the self that emerges from doubt and affirms itself with absolute certainty, that we'll explore here. Throughout Meditations on First Philosophy, Descartes reaches a state of total suspension of judgment. He doubts the senses, the external world, mathematics, and even logic itself, imagining the possibility of a malicious demon, a hypothetical being that could deceive him even in his simplest thoughts. Everything seems unstable. Everything could be an illusion. And yet, there's something that even the most radical doubt cannot destroy. The fact that, while doubting, someone is thinking. And whoever is thinking, even if they know nothing else for sure, knows one thing with complete certainty, that they exist as a thinking being. It's in this moment of total collapse that an unshakable truth appears. It's not an idea inherited from others, not a sensory fact, nor a mathematical calculation. It's a truth lived in the inner experience of doubt. If I'm being deceived, I'm thinking. If I'm confused, I'm thinking. If I'm searching for truth, I'm a thinking being. And that alone is enough to affirm my existence. I think, therefore I am. This proposition is so firm and certain that the most extravagant suppositions of the skeptics are powerless to shake it. Bailly, Meditations on First Philosophy, Second Meditation. It's important to understand that the Cogito is not a logical deduction or an argument built from premises, like, all men are mortal. Socrates is a man, therefore, Socrates is mortal. The Cogito doesn't rely on anything external. It's immediate, self-evident, intuitive. The moment someone thinks, I think, the existence of the thinker is revealed as undeniable. Even trying to deny it proves it, because the act of denial is itself a thought. This makes the Cogito an absolute, universal, and necessary certainty. For the first time, Descartes finds a truth that doesn't depend on the senses, tradition, or formal logic. It arises directly from the act of thinking itself. In the middle of the storm of doubt, the self appears as a solid island, the only thing that cannot be swept away by uncertainty, the turn toward the subject. This moment marks a deep transformation in Western thought. Before Descartes, philosophy often looked outward for truth, toward the cosmos, nature, God, or eternal principles. Truth was something outside the human being, something to be contemplated or discovered. With Descartes, the direction reverses. The starting point of truth is no longer out there, but within, in the subject, in consciousness, in the act of thinking. The self is no longer just part of the world. It becomes the foundation of all possible knowledge. This shift, the so-called subjective turn, is one of the pillars of modern philosophy. It sets the stage for thinkers like Kant, who would later define the subject as the condition for all experience, and Husserl, who would describe consciousness as pure intentionality. But it all begins here, with the recognition that the human being is, above all, a thinking being, and that all certainty depends, in the end, on the activity of thought. A thing that thinks. After affirming the Cogito, Descartes asks who this I is, this self that thinks, and he gives a classic answer. But what then am I? A thing that thinks. What is that? A thing that doubts, understands, affirms, denies, wills, refuses, and also imagines and perceives. A Meditations on First Philosophy, Second Meditation. Here, Descartes defines the self not as a body nor as a rational animal, as Aristotle said, but as a thinking substance, a being that thinks, feels, desires, doubts, and imagines. The self is defined by mental activity, not by physical form. Even if the body were an illusion, if hands, eyes, and senses didn't exist, thought would remain. It's thought that guarantees the existence of the self. This idea of the res cogitans, the thinking thing, opens the path to Descartes' famous dualism, the distinction between the thinking substance, mind or soul, and the extended substance, body or physical world. But before reaching that dualism, he must first establish the thinking self as the foundation of all truth. The Cogito also has a deep existential meaning. Descartes wrote during a time when the old certainties were collapsing. Europe was divided by religious wars. Science was breaking away from tradition. The Church, once the uncontested authority of thought, was losing its monopoly. In this unstable world, Descartes wasn't just thinking. He was searching for solid ground on which to stand as a conscious being. And he found it within himself. The Cogito was his answer to the collapse of external authorities. When everything fails, thought remains. When the world is uncertain, doubt reveals the certainty of the self. This gives human beings a new philosophical dignity. We are the center of truth, the starting point of knowledge. With the Cogito, Descartes gives philosophy a new foundation, subjective truth, born from conscious experience. Certainty no longer depends on something external, but on the awareness of thought itself. This idea would deeply influence later philosophy, from German idealism to phenomenology to existentialism. All of them, in one way or another, begin from Descartes' insight that consciousness is where truth manifests itself. The certainty of the Cogito is not just factual, it's reflective. It doesn't merely say, I exist, but I know that I exist because I think. Consciousness turns inward and recognizes itself. This kind of certainty can't be achieved through observation, only through direct self-awareness. The Cogito isn't the end of Descartes' philosophy, it's the beginning. He didn't intend to stop at this one truth, but to use it as the foundation for rebuilding all of human knowledge. The existence of God, the reliability of reason, the reality of the external world, and the validity of science. In Discourse on the Method, he compares knowledge to a building. If that building has been constructed on weak foundations, inherited beliefs, sensory illusions, or untested opinions, it must eventually collapse. So everything must be torn down to the ground and rebuilt from a single, solid base. It is necessary, once in one's life, to put everything in doubt, so as to begin again from firm and certain foundations. Meditations on First Philosophy, First Meditation. The Cogito is that foundation, the first unshakable stone on which all knowledge can be rebuilt. From there, Descartes creates a rule for truth. Accept as true only what is perceived clearly and distinctly by reason. Everything that we perceive clearly and distinctly is true. Principles of Philosophy, I 45. This principle becomes his compass. Any idea that's unclear or confused must be rejected. Only ideas that shine with clarity and distinction can count as true. Even though Descartes starts with the I, he isn't proposing a philosophy of pure isolation. His goal isn't to claim that only the self exists. On the contrary, he wants to rebuild objective knowledge about the world, God, science, and reality, but to do so safely, starting from something absolutely certain. Before he can prove that the external world exists, he must first prove that he exists, and that his reason can be trusted. Without that, all knowledge would be built on sand. That's why the Cogito is not only an existential truth, but also an epistemological one, the starting point for everything that follows. From it, Descartes will go on to argue for the existence of God, the reliability of the mind, and the reality of the external world. By making the Cogito the foundation of knowledge, Descartes gave birth to a new idea of the self, no longer passive or dependent on tradition, but active, reflective, and autonomous. Humanity became the center of knowledge, capable of discovering truth through reason alone. This was a turning point in history. With Descartes, the modern subject was born, the individual who thinks, questions, and grounds knowledge in reason. It was a transformation that shaped not only philosophy, but also science, politics, ethics, and the very idea of what it means to be human. From that point on, knowledge no longer depended on dogma or external authority. It arose from autonomous reason, disciplined by method and guided by the search for truth. The phrase, "I think, therefore I am," became more than a philosophical statement. It became the cornerstone of a new world, one where the human mind could stand on its own, discover its own certainty, and rebuild knowledge from within. Descartes showed us that even when every other certainty collapses, there's still one place where truth can begin, inside conscious thought. And from that single point, the architecture of knowledge, firm, precise, and profoundly human, can rise again. After reaching the absolute certainty of "I think, therefore I am," René Descartes began one of the most ambitious reconstructions of philosophical knowledge in history. From that first truth, the certainty of the self as a thinking being, he developed a fundamental distinction that would forever shape Western philosophy: the division between two radically different kinds of substance, res cogitans and res extensa. This distinction became known as Cartesian dualism, and it proposes that human beings are composed of two distinct principles: an immaterial soul, which thinks, feels, and is conscious, and a material body, which occupies space, has physical extension and is governed by the laws of physics. This idea not only reorganized philosophy, but also deeply influenced science, psychology, theology, and modern metaphysics. But how did Descartes arrive at this distinction? And why did it become so influential and so controversial at the same time? At the center of Descartes' thought is the search for a foundation that is clear and distinct, something absolutely certain. He begins with what cannot be doubted, the thinking I. Radical doubt had already put aside everything that could deceive him, the senses, the body, and the external world. But the activity of thinking could not be doubted. Thus, Descartes concludes that thinking is the very essence of the subject. The self is, in its essence, a thinking substance, res cogitans. But then he asks, if I think, but also perceive a body and a world around me, if I feel hunger, pain, cold, and heat, what is this other aspect of reality that imposes itself on my senses? To explain this, he distinguishes a second kind of substance, res extensa, the extended thing, that which occupies space and has size, shape, and volume. The body, unlike the mind, can be measured, weighed, and examined. It belongs to the physical realm, the world of matter. There are two substances. One is the thinking substance, whose essence is thought. The other is the extended substance, whose essence is extension. Principles of Philosophy, Part 1. This statement lays the foundation of Cartesian dualism. The mind and the body are two different kinds of substance with entirely different natures. The mind thinks but does not occupy space. The body occupies space but does not think. What is a substance? To understand dualism, we need to understand what Descartes means by substance. In philosophy, a substance is something that exists in itself, something that does not depend on anything else to exist, at least in a relative sense. For Descartes, the only truly independent substance is God, who exists by his own nature. But within creation, there are two dependent yet distinct substances, mind and matter. These two can exist separately and have properties that never overlap. The mind is defined by its ability to think, to doubt, affirm, deny, imagine, feel, and will. The body is defined by extension. It occupies space, is divisible, and can be moved or touched. Descartes believed this separation was not only clear, but necessary. A thinking thing cannot be divided into parts like a piece of wood, and an extended thing cannot think. Therefore, mind and body are ontologically distinct. One of the strongest claims of Cartesian dualism is that the soul can exist independently of the body, an idea with both philosophical and theological implications. In the second meditation, Descartes reflects, even if all sensory data were illusions and the body didn't exist, thought would still remain. That means the soul does not depend on the body to exist. I am then precisely a thinking thing, that is, a mind, an understanding, or a reason, things which were unknown to me before. I am, however, a real and truly existing thing. Meditations on First Philosophy, Second Meditation. This conclusion supports not only knowledge, but also the belief in the immortality of the soul. If the body can be destroyed, but the soul can think independently of it, then its existence transcends the physical. This view aligned with Christian theology and helped Descartes reconcile reason and faith. However, here arises one of the great difficulties of his theory. If the soul is immaterial and the body is material, how do they interact? If they are substances of completely different natures, how can one affect the other? This question is the origin of the famous mind-body problem. Descartes insists that, although they are distinct, mind and body interact. The body affects the mind, for example, when we feel physical pain and experience mental suffering, and the mind affects the body, when we decide to move an arm and it moves. But how can this happen if one is material and the other immaterial. Descartes tries to solve this dilemma by locating their point of contact in the pineal gland, a small structure in the brain that he believed served as the bridge between soul and body. But this explanation was quickly criticized by later philosophers and scientists as unsatisfactory. After all, how can something without extension, the mind, act on something extended, the body? If their natures are so different, the link between them seems mysterious. This became one of the most debated issues in philosophy, leading to critiques from Spinoza, Leibniz, Locke, Hume, and Kant. Even so, Descartes' greatest contribution was to put the mind-body relationship at the center of modern philosophy, a question that remains alive in today's cognitive science, neuroscience, and philosophy of mind. Cartesian dualism had far-reaching consequences. In philosophy, it launched the rationalist tradition that values introspection, clarity of consciousness, and the autonomy of the thinking subject. In science, it encouraged a mechanistic view of nature, seeing the body as a kind of machine governed by physical laws. In theology, it supported the notion of an immortal soul, separable from the body, consistent with Christian doctrine. In psychology and neuroscience, it raised lasting questions about how mental states, pain, desire, thought, can arise from or interact with physical state. Despite the criticisms, Cartesian dualism created a new way to think about human nature, as a meeting point of two interacting principles. This framework shaped modern thought and brought to light the complexity of human experience. Many have accused Descartes of creating an artificial split between mind and body, one that led to centuries of separation between the mental and the physical, the psychological and the biological. Others argued that he never truly explained how mind and body interact. But even with its flaws, Cartesian dualism remains one of philosophy's turning points. It forces us to ask questions that are still unsolved. What is the mind? How does it relate to the body? Can consciousness be reduced to physical and chemical processes? Or is there something in us that transcends matter? All of these questions began with Descartes, when he first distinguished the thinking self from the extended body, opening the way for a new understanding of human nature. Cartesian dualism teaches that the human being is not a single block of existence, but a meeting of two worlds: the world of consciousness, thought, and freedom, and the world of matter, extension, and physical causality. Understanding this distinction is to grasp one of the deepest dilemmas of human existence. Perhaps we still don't have all the answers, but Descartes was the one who taught us to ask the right questions. And that alone was a monumental step forward in the history of thought. The impact of Descartes' philosophy didn't end with his time. His dualism, the separation of mind, res cogitans, and body, res extensa, triggered a metaphysical earthquake whose aftershocks are still felt today. By declaring that humans are composed of two independent and distinct substances, Descartes inaugurated a new paradigm for understanding reality, consciousness, and human identity. In the centuries that followed, his ideas reshaped three major fields: philosophy of mind, metaphysics, and the ongoing mind-body interaction problem. Philosophy of mind. Before Descartes, the soul was discussed mostly in religious terms, linked to morality or salvation. After Descartes, it became an object of rational inquiry. Questions like, what is consciousness? How do thoughts relate to brain states? Can we know other minds? All trace back to him. Metaphysics. By proposing two distinct substances, Descartes changed how philosophers understood reality itself. Spinoza responded by denying dualism altogether, claiming there is only one substance, God or nature, and that mind and body are just two aspects of it. Leibniz offered another alternative: monads, indivisible metaphysical units that never truly interact but exist in a pre-established harmony. The mind-body interaction problem. Even today, philosophers and scientists wrestle with the question Descartes raised: how can a thought move a body? Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia herself challenged Descartes on this, arguing that something without extension cannot push or be pushed. In reaction to Descartes, several new theories emerged. Materialist monism. Only matter exists. The mind is not separate, but rather a product or function of the brain. Modern neuroscience continues to build on this view. Idealist monism. Only mind or spirit truly exists. Matter is an appearance, a projection of consciousness, as in the works of Berkeley or Hegel. Contemporary theories, functionalism, logical behaviorism, and mind-brain identity theories all attempt to naturalize the mind, while phenomenology, Husserl, and hermeneutics, Gadamer, argue for a more integrated understanding of subject and world. Even so, Cartesian dualism remains alive, not as an outdated relic, but as a challenge that keeps inspiring inquiry into the nature of consciousness, identity, and existence. Whenever we debate artificial intelligence, animal consciousness, altered mental states, or spiritual experiences, we are, in one way or another, still responding to Descartes. His essential question, what am I as a thinking being in relation to my body, still echoes in discussions on personal identity, medical ethics, and the philosophy of technology. Descartes' dualism was a turning point. It marked the shift from an integrated view of humans, body and soul, as a unified being, as in Aristotle, to the divided and analytical view of modernity. From this moment on, the subject sees itself as a mind inside a machine. This rupture brought both progress and tension. In science, it allowed a mechanical understanding of nature, where the body could be studied like any other object. In ethics, it raised questions about consciousness, free will, and moral responsibility. In psychology, it led to the separation between behavior, external, and mind, internal. In theology, it revived debates about the soul's immortality and its relation to the body and to God. Descartes left us an ambiguous legacy. He freed reason to study the mind, but also created an abyss between body and consciousness that we're still trying to bridge. His dualism gave voice to the complexity of being human, to the tension between flesh and thought, matter and meaning. And even centuries later, the question remains, who are we really? A machine made of flesh, or a spirit that thinks, or perhaps both? Mysteriously distinct, yet inseparably united. René Descartes is widely known for his strict rationalism, his methodical doubt, and his famous statement, "I think, therefore I am." But his philosophy doesn't stop with the thinking self. Descartes understood that, to make the entire structure of knowledge truly solid, he needed a foundation even more absolute than the self: God. In philosophical tradition, the existence of God was often treated as a theological topic. Descartes, however, approaches it from an epistemological point of view, that is, within the framework of knowledge itself. His goal isn't simply to prove that God exists, but to show that God's existence is necessary for us to trust reason and knowledge at all. In other words, without God, even the Cogito, "I think, therefore I am," would still be threatened by doubt. For that reason, Descartes presents two main proofs of God's existence, developed especially in his Meditations on First Philosophy, a work that can be seen as a rational form of spiritual exercise. Let's understand what these arguments are and what they truly mean. The context. From doubt to the need for God. Before presenting his arguments, it's important to remember where Descartes stands in his philosophical journey. He has already gone through the process of radical doubt, questioning the senses, the external world, and even mathematical truths. The only certainty he has found so far is the Cogito. I am a thinking being. But that certainty, by itself, is still solitary and fragile. To move forward, Descartes must ensure that human reason itself is not being deceived by a malicious demon. He needs to prove that whatever appears clear and distinct to the mind is truly reliable. At this stage, the idea of God becomes crucial. If it's possible to demonstrate rationally that God exists, and that God is not a deceiver, then we can trust our thinking and rebuild all knowledge upon it. God, therefore, is not only an object of faith, but a rational guarantee of truth. The first proof, the idea of perfection. The first proof is known as the proof from the idea of God, or the causal argument from perfection, presented mainly in the third meditation. The reasoning goes as follows. I have within me the idea of an absolutely perfect being. Now, that idea could not have come from myself, because I am imperfect. Therefore, it must have come from a truly perfect being, God. Descartes realizes that he possesses in his mind the idea of God as a supreme being, eternal, unchanging, all-knowing, all-powerful, and absolutely perfect. This idea is clear and distinct in his consciousness. But where did it come from? Here, Descartes relies on a key principle from classical metaphysics, reinterpreted through reason. An effect cannot have more reality than its cause. If a certain idea exists in the mind, it must have been caused by something with at least as much reality as the idea itself. But Descartes knows he is limited, fallible, imperfect, full of doubt and error. So how could such a being produce in himself the idea of something infinitely perfect? That would be like nothing producing something. The only possible explanation is that this idea was placed in his mind by a being that actually possesses all perfections. In other words, God exists because only God could be the cause of the idea of God. It is necessary to conclude that God exists, for I could not have invented the idea of a being so perfect. This argument carries great philosophical weight. It starts from within, from the analysis of consciousness, and shows that, even in our inner world, there exists an idea that surpasses us and points to something beyond the self, a being that grounds reason itself. The second proof. The ontological argument. The second proof appears in the fifth meditation and is known as the ontological argument, first developed by St. Anselm in the 11th century, but reformulated by Descartes in a clearer, more rational structure. The argument can be summarized as, existence belongs to the very essence of God. To deny his existence would be like denying that a triangle has three sides. Let's unpack that. For Descartes, God's essence is absolute perfection, and among all perfections, existence itself is one. Something that doesn't exist would lack a necessary perfection. Therefore, it couldn't be absolutely perfect. So, if we are speaking of a being that has every perfection, it must include existence. Descartes compares this relationship between essence and existence to that between a triangle and its three angles. We can understand the concept of a triangle even without seeing one. We know that its sides add up to 180 degrees. These properties belong to its very essence. Likewise, when we think of God as a supremely perfect being, we recognize that existence is inseparable from his essence. To think of God and deny his existence would be as contradictory as thinking of a triangle with four sides. The existence of God is no less inseparable from his essence than the fact that the angles of a triangle equal 180 degrees. Meditations on First Philosophy, Fifth Meditation. Therefore, God doesn't merely can exist, he must exist. His essence demands existence. This is the ontological proof, a rational deduction drawn from the very concept of God. God as the foundation of knowledge. It's important to see that Descartes isn't trying to persuade religious believers. He's showing that reason alone can demonstrate God's existence without relying on revelation or faith. This approach is revolutionary for two reasons. It brings the idea of God into a rational philosophical framework, rather than leaving it purely theological. It shows that God's existence is necessary for knowledge to be trustworthy, because a perfect God would not allow us to be constantly deceived by our reason. In other words, without God, there would be no way to ensure that our clear and distinct ideas correspond to reality. God becomes the guarantor of truth, the ultimate foundation of reason's reliability. We must acknowledge that everything we perceive clearly and distinctly is true only because God exists, and because all that is within us comes from him. Meditations on First Philosophy, Fifth Meditation. Overcoming the evil genius. Another function of the proofs is to eliminate radical skepticism, especially the evil genius hypothesis. Descartes had earlier proposed this thought experiment, Imagine a powerful and cunning being that deceives us about everything, even basic math. Such a being could make us believe that 2 plus 2 = 4 when in fact it equals 5. If that were possible, nothing could be trusted. Not reason, not science, not perception. The only way to escape this terrifying doubt is to prove that the being who created us is not deceptive, that he is perfect and good. Natural light teaches us that deception depends on some defect. Therefore, it is impossible for there to be any deception in what comes from God. Third meditation. By proving that God exists and that he is not a deceiver, Descartes dispels the spectre of radical skepticism once and for all. The evil genius cannot exist because a perfect God would not allow such deception. This allows the mind to trust its clear and distinct ideas. Reason can finally operate freely and securely. Knowledge, which seemed suspended in uncertainty, now has solid ground. God as the bridge between mind and world. Descartes' philosophy begins with the thinking subject, but it doesn't want to remain locked inside it. He wants to prove that there is an external world, and that human reason can know it. But moving from the I to the world requires a bridge, and that bridge is, again, God. According to Descartes, we possess innate ideas. Ideas that didn't come from experience, but were placed in us by God himself. The most important of these is the idea of God as a perfect being. If God gave us this idea, and if he is not a deceiver, then these innate ideas can be trusted. They lead us toward truth, not illusion. Once God's existence and goodness are established, Descartes can also affirm that the external world exists because we have a natural inclination to believe in it, and a good God would not create us with a tendency to believe in something false. God would not be a deceiver if he placed in me an irresistible inclination to believe that there is a world outside me, if such a world did not in fact exist. Thus, the proof of God's existence rebuilds reality itself, from mind to matter, from thought to science. The rational God of science. Another key point is that Descartes' God is not a God of miracles or mysteries, but a rational, mathematical God, the guarantor of the world's order. This makes him compatible with the rise of modern science. For Descartes, God doesn't intervene capriciously in nature. Rather, he created a universe governed by precise and stable laws. That's why science is possible, why we can calculate, predict, and understand the workings of nature. In this sense, science is not opposed to faith, but a consequence of divine creation. To know the world is ultimately to honor God's rational design. Reason and faith united. Although Descartes was a rationalist, he was also a Christian. His philosophical project wasn't meant to destroy faith, but to show that reason can lead to God on its own. He believed that both the existence of God and the immortality of the soul could be demonstrated rationally, and that these truths form a secure foundation for philosophy, morality, and spiritual life. This attempt to reconcile reason and faith profoundly influenced later thinkers such as Spinoza, Leibniz, and even Kant, each of whom sought in their own way to bridge reason and transcendence. The heart of Cartesian philosophy. In Descartes' system, the proofs of God's existence are not an afterthought or a gesture of belief. They are the core of his philosophy. God is the link between mind and reality, between doubt and certainty, between thought and the world. Without God, the Cogito would be a solitary bubble. With God, thought can trust itself, reach beyond itself, and build reliable knowledge. God is the guarantor of truth, the refuter of skepticism, and the ultimate foundation of reason. By demonstrating this, Descartes didn't just revisit an ancient question, he redefined the place of divinity in human thought, not as dogma imposed from above, but as a rational necessity, the cornerstone of knowledge itself. René Descartes is known above all as the founder of modern rationalism, the man who dared to doubt everything in order to find a secure foundation for knowledge. Yet, it would be a mistake to think his philosophy opposed religious faith. In truth, Descartes lived and thought during a time when reason and faith were still searching for dialogue. He was one of the few who tried to show that they not only could coexist, but actually complement one another. In this lesson, we'll explore how Descartes, despite his deep commitment to reason, never abandoned his Christian faith, and why he believed that the existence of God and the immortality of the soul could be demonstrated rationally without appealing to dogma or revelation. To understand Descartes, we need to look at the world he lived in. He was born in the early 17th century, during a period marked by conflict between Catholics and Protestants, the rise of modern science, and the decline of scholastic philosophy. The world Descartes inherited was religiously fragmented. The Protestant Reformation had broken the authority of the Catholic Church, and religious wars were tearing Europe apart. Meanwhile, science was emerging as a new way of understanding reality, challenging traditional interpretations rooted in the Bible and Aristotelian metaphysics. In that context, many saw reason as the enemy of faith. Descartes, however, believed the opposite. That reason, when used correctly, could be faith's most loyal ally. It never entered my mind that natural reasoning could oppose faith. Rather, the deeper one examines reason, the more convincing the foundations of faith become. This desire to reconcile reason and religion runs throughout Descartes' work. One of his boldest philosophical ideas is the conviction that human reason alone can prove the existence of God. And not only that, but also demonstrate that the soul is immaterial and immortal. This view aligns with thinkers like St. Augustine and Thomas Aquinas, but Descartes distances himself from scholastic theology. He wants to show that faith can stand on its own, supported by rational, methodical, and independent thought, not by the authority of the Church. This project is clearest in Meditations on First Philosophy. There, Descartes begins by doubting everything, even religion. But from the Cogito, he rebuilds certainty. And in this reconstruction, 2 full meditations are dedicated to proving God's existence, and another to the distinction between mind and body. What matters most isn't just the content of those proofs, but their method. They are written as logical deductions based on reason alone. For Descartes, believing isn't the opposite of thinking. It's a higher form of knowing when built on solid foundations. In Descartes' philosophy, God isn't an ornament of religious tradition. He plays an essential role in the very structure of reason. After finding his first certainty, I think therefore I am, Descartes asks, can I trust my own reason? What if everything is an illusion? What if some evil genius deceives me even when I think I'm reasoning correctly? This is where the proof of God's existence becomes crucial. Descartes shows that God, being perfect, cannot be a deceiver. Therefore, whatever is perceived clearly and distinctly by reason must be true. Because God created us with that capacity, the truthfulness of God guarantees that whatever we perceive clearly and distinctly is true. Meditations on First Philosophy, 5th Meditation. In this way, God becomes not only the object of faith, but the guarantor of reason itself. Without God, reason would remain isolated within the Cogito. With God, it opens to the world. Another key point in the harmony between faith and reason, according to Descartes, is the proof of the soul's immortality. In his system, human beings are made up of 2 substances: res cogitans, the mind, soul, or consciousness, whose essence is thought; res extensa, the body, whose essence is physical extension in space. The soul, as a thinking substance, doesn't depend on the body to exist. It is indivisible, cannot decay, and isn't made of matter. Descartes claims that even if the body dies, the soul continues to exist because its nature is separate and independent. I can clearly conceive of myself as a thinking thing apart from the body. From this, I conclude that I am truly distinct from it and can exist without it. Meditations on First Philosophy, 6th Meditation. This distinction between body and soul, based purely on reason, opens the way for the Christian doctrine of the soul's immortality, but now supported by philosophical reasoning rather than dogma. Descartes' project shows that faith and reason don't have to move in opposite direction. On the contrary, reason can lead to faith, and faith can be strengthened by reason. He believed that the great mysteries of religion, like the existence of God and the immortality of the soul, shouldn't be accepted only out of tradition or authority. They could and should be examined and even partially demonstrated through the natural light of reason. However, Descartes also recognized the limits of reason. He didn't seek to replace faith or reduce religion to logic. His aim was to provide rational grounding for what faith already intuited as true, showing that rational thought doesn't contradict belief, but rather clarifies and strengthens it. Unlike many later thinkers who rejected religion or treated it as outdated, Descartes sought to preserve harmony between philosophy and theology. This is visible not only in his ideas, but also in his writing style. He composed meditations on first philosophy in a devotional tone, almost like spiritual exercises, echoing the method of St. Ignatius of Loyola, founder of the Jesuits, with whom Descartes studied in his youth. Each meditation represents a step toward truth, like a pilgrim in search of rational enlightenment. Descartes was also careful in his relationship with the Church. He tried to show that his philosophy didn't oppose faith and often emphasized the value of Christian doctrine. His goal was to reform philosophy, not attack religion. For many of his contemporaries, this position was difficult to grasp. In a time of extremes, between those who abandoned faith for science and those who rejected reason for tradition, Descartes' approach required a rare balance. But it is precisely this balance that makes his thought so relevant today. Descartes teaches us that reason doesn't have to destroy faith, and faith doesn't have to fear reason. They can, and perhaps must, walk together, each illuminating the other. His legacy invites us to think critically, yet confidently. Critically, because he calls us to think for ourselves. Confidently, because he believes that reason, guided by humility and rigor, can lead us toward the highest truths. Faith and reason are not rivals, but allies. Reason doesn't replace faith. It clarifies, refines, and strengthens it. And faith, in turn, guides reason beyond what is visible, opening space for knowledge that transcends the material. For Descartes, to believe is not the opposite of thinking. It is to think deeply, with openness and trust that truth exists and can be found. Despite his belief in the harmony between reason and faith, Descartes lived amid constant tension with religious institutions. His philosophical project, rebuilding knowledge based on reason rather than Aristotelian scholasticism, challenged deeply rooted intellectual structures. He was born in 1596 and died in 1650, during a period when the Catholic Church still dominated European thought. Universities were steeped in Aristotelian theology, and any new philosophy was subject to scrutiny or censorship. Descartes studied in Jesuit institutions and knew scholastic thought well, but he soon realized that it couldn't offer the certainty he sought. He broke with that tradition when he decided to start from individual reason, method, doubt, and clarity, rather than the authority of ancient thinkers or the Church. In his Discourse on Method, 1637, Descartes famously wrote that he had learned much from old systems of thought, but built upon such shaky foundations the uncertain house of my opinions. Statements like this were viewed as attacks on traditional education. His rejection of scholastic philosophy, the Aristotelian foundation of Catholic universities, worried theologians. They feared that his focus on autonomous reason and his mechanistic view of nature would erode faith and doctrine. Some church authorities accused his philosophy of undermining belief in the soul's immortality and even the doctrine of transubstantiation, since Descartes' metaphysics rejected the old distinction between substance and accident. In several regions, especially in the Netherlands, his ideas were met with open resistance. Theologians accused him of encouraging skepticism, materialism, and even atheism. Eventually, parts of his work were placed on the index of forbidden books by the Church. Descartes understood the risks and chose to live much of his life in the Netherlands, where there was greater intellectual freedom. He also delayed publishing some of his works, such as The World, to avoid conflict. Despite this, Descartes continued to emphasize that his philosophy aimed to strengthen, not weaken, Christian faith. He exchanged letters with theologians like Father Marin Mersenne, explaining that his purpose was to support belief through reason. At the center of the controversy was the role he gave to human reason. Descartes claimed that good sense, or reason, is the best distributed thing in the world, meaning everyone has the capacity to think for themselves. This idea clashed with the Church's belief that philosophy should always be guided by revelation and theological authority. For many theologians, such intellectual autonomy risked leading to heresy or relativism. History had shown that philosophers who trusted reason too much often strayed from orthodoxy. Even though Descartes maintained belief in God and the soul, his independent method of inquiry was enough to alarm the Church, since it shifted the foundation of truth from divine authority to the reasoning individual. After his death, Cartesian philosophy continued to divide opinions. Some followers tried to reconcile it with Catholic doctrine, while others pushed it toward more radical conclusions. In response, the Church fought to reassert scholastic traditions and restrict Cartesian influence. Debates erupted in universities, and in some places, Descartes' works were banned. The tension between Descartes and the Church wasn't just personal or institutional. It symbolized a deeper historical transition, the shift from the authority of tradition to the authority of individual reason. This change marked the birth of modern philosophy. Humanity began to think for itself, to question, to doubt, and the Church had to confront this new world. The result was both liberation and conflict, intellectual freedom and scientific progress on one side, but growing secularism and a crisis of religious authority on the other. In this sense, the conflict between Descartes and the Church was not just about one man. It was about the birth of modernity itself. Descartes, though deeply Christian in spirit, became a symbol of that transition, a philosopher who sought to reconcile faith and reason, yet whose very method helped create a world where reason would eventually stand on its own. When René Descartes proposed that the physical world behaves like a machine, he wasn't just offering a nice metaphor. He was introducing a radically new way of thinking about nature. At a time when the old Aristotelian scholastic worldview was collapsing, a worldview that saw all beings as having built-in natures, purposes, and forms, Descartes suggested that the universe could instead be understood as a mechanism, bodies that extend, occupy space, move, collide with one another, and follow quantifiable laws. This idea profoundly changed science, philosophy, and metaphysics. Let's explore how Descartes developed this vision, why he thought it was necessary, and what it meant for physics and modern thought. From Aristotle's world to the mechanical universe. In Descartes' youth, late 1500s to early 1600s, education was still dominated by Aristotelian scholastic thinking. Nature was said to be filled with substantial forms and final causes, inherent purposes and goals. Stones were thought to fall because they sought their natural place. Living beings had built-in ends or purposes, and the universe itself was guided by a teleological order. Everything moved toward its natural fulfillment. But as Galileo, Kepler, and the rise of mathematical astronomy began reshaping science, that worldview started to show its limits. Descartes realized that such explanations didn't allow for mathematical certainty or mechanical control of physical reality. In his works on natural philosophy, particularly in Principles of Philosophy, 1644, he argued that physical bodies should be understood in terms of extension, occupying space, and that every movement or collision could be explained in terms of measurable parts, quantities, and impacts. Nature, in this sense, became something that reason could model like a machine. Descartes' physics aimed at purely mechanistic explanations of natural phenomena. This meant replacing explanations based on substantial forms, or inner purposes, with ones based on extension, motion, impact, and law. For Descartes, whatever is physical, whatever belongs to the world of matter, is characterized by extension. It takes up space, can be divided, at least in theory, and can be measured. The very essence of material substance, res extensa, is extension itself. This makes it possible to treat matter as something that can be studied mathematically and experimentally. The world as a machine. From this view, everything that moves in space, humans, animals, natural objects, even the stars, can be seen as part of a vast mechanism. Descartes even proposed the idea of animal machines, animal machine, living organisms whose actions could be explained as purely mechanical functions, though he reserved a different status for the human mind, res cogitans. Nature, then, became a system of parts in motion, colliding, transferring momentum, and following universal physical laws. For Descartes, the physical world doesn't act through hidden forms or purposes, but through laws of motion and quantity. Applying the same clarity and distinctness that he demanded in philosophy, Descartes sought to bring that rigor to physics. For him, understanding nature meant showing how things happen, describing trajectories, quantities, and impacts, not simply that they happen. According to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, Descartes' physics tried to explain natural phenomena without reference to the scholastic principles of substantial forms and real qualities. In other words, no hidden forces, no mysterious purposes, only mechanics. He used analogies from machines, gears, pulleys, pistons to describe natural processes. The movement of the heavens, for example, was explained through a system of vortices, swirling matter carrying planets around the sun. The fall of bodies or the transfer of force was seen as the impact of moving particles. In his view, the universe was quite literally a giant machine. Space was filled with matter in motion, forming vortices that moved celestial bodies, a mechanical explanation for the heavens. This mechanical model also applied to the human body, to the flow of blood, to atmospheric phenomena. It suggested that the same universal mathematical laws govern everything, from the sky to the earth. That broke with the medieval notion that heavenly and earthly realms follow different kinds of causes, breaking from Aristotle. In rejecting Aristotle, Descartes was targeting two core ideas: substantial forms and final causes, natural purposes. In the Aristotelian tradition, every natural thing was made of matter, hyle, and form, morphe. The form gave the thing its identity and goal. It was what made a stone, or an oak. Moreover, everything had a final cause, an inner purpose toward which it naturally aimed. For example, a stone was said to fall because its form sought its natural place at the center of the earth. Living beings grew and acted to fulfill their natural purposes. This teleological view shaped not only physics, but also biology, metaphysics, and ethics. But Descartes saw serious problems in this way of thinking. Such explanations, he argued, didn't truly explain anything. Substantial forms and final causes were hidden. Saying that a stone falls because of its form doesn't explain how it falls. Even their defenders admitted that these forms were mysterious and unknowable. To Descartes, that meant they weren't real explanations at all. Attributing purpose to matter was absurd. To say that a stone wants to fall gives it knowledge or intention, which for Descartes makes no sense. Matter doesn't think or choose, it simply moves when acted upon. Aristotelian explanations blocked progress. The idea of natural purposes and hidden forms made it impossible to treat matter mathematically or to build a universal science based on law, motion, and geometry. So, Descartes rejected these old notions and proposed a new foundation. The physical world could be explained through extension, motion, and contact. No invisible essences, no inner goals. A physics of quantity, not quality. For Descartes, physical explanation had to rely only on measurable properties. The world could be described through the motion of particles, not through metaphysical forms. Aristotle's gravity. A heavy object falls because its form seeks the center of the earth. Descartes' gravity, motion and impact among particles in a universal vortex cause bodies to move downward. No purpose, no knowledge in the stone. Similarly, qualities like hot or cold, wet or dry, were replaced by differences in the motion and arrangement of particles. measurable changes, not hidden properties. This shift from quality to quantity made modern science possible. The mechanistic revolution and its consequences. Descartes' mechanistic model had enormous consequences. In metaphysics, nature was no longer seen as alive or guided by purposes. The physical world became a vast machine operating by fixed laws. The old role of forms and purposes was eliminated. This led to a dualist ontology, mind and matter, and a more abstract science. In science, explanation turned away from why things exist toward how they work. It encouraged deduction, geometry, and experiment instead of speculation about hidden purposes. In philosophy of nature, organisms, including humans, were understood as mechanisms. This raised new questions about life, consciousness, and automation. Questions that still shape modern debates about AI and biology. In epistemology, knowledge was no longer based on inherited categories or tradition, but on clarity, method, and measurement. Human reason could understand nature mechanically, using its own tools. Limits and criticism. Descartes' mechanistic view wasn't without problem. Some philosophers argued that forms and purposes still play a role in understanding life, consciousness, and moral order. Others noted that Descartes never fully escaped metaphysics. After all, he still invoked God as the first cause, the creator who designed and sustains the great cosmic machine. And many critics pointed out that pure mechanics couldn't explain everything. Phenomena like light, heat, or the human mind seemed to go beyond the laws of motion and collision. Even so, Descartes' turn toward mechanism marked a decisive break, one that made modern science possible. The birth of the modern world. By rejecting Aristotelian forms and purposes, Descartes helped establish the rise of modern science based on laws, machines, experiments, and quantification. The value of the thinking subject, the autonomous mind capable of understanding nature mathematically, the separation between natural philosophy and theology, science and faith, no longer overlapping as they once had. A new focus on how things work, rather than why they exist. This shift, from teleology to mechanics, was one of the pillars of the scientific revolution. In short, Descartes' break with Aristotelian physics wasn't just a technical change, it was a philosophical transformation. He replaced the old language of forms and purposes with the language of motion, extension, and law. By doing so, he turned the natural world into something that could be understood, measured, and controlled, not merely contemplated or revered. And yet, within this great machine, the human thinker, the conscious mind, remains central. The one who observes, calculates, and seeks to understand the universe that God, the supreme engineer, set in motion. Descartes' vision of a world machine not only launched modern physics, but also redefined what it means to be human, a mind within a mechanical universe, capable of reason, inquiry, and wonder. When Descartes stated that there exists a thinking substance, the soul or mind, and an extended substance, the body or matter, he introduced one of the deepest tensions in the history of philosophy. How can two radically different substances interact? This is the famous mind-body problem, which has challenged philosophers, scientists, and theologians since the 17th century. For Descartes, the mind, res cogitans, is defined by its essential attribute, thinking, doubting, understanding, affirming, denying, willing, imagining. The body, res extensa, on the other hand, is defined by extension. It occupies space, can be divided, and is subject to movement, impact, and magnitude. He writes in the Meditations on First Philosophy, "I am, therefore, precisely a thinking thing." What is that? A mind, or intelligence, or reason, at Second Meditation. And also, the essence of matter, or extended substance, consists simply in its being extended in length, breadth, and depth. These ideas make it clear that body and mind have fundamentally different natures, The mind does not occupy space or have parts, while the body does. It is divisible, extended, and governed by physical laws. From this, Descartes concludes that mind and body are distinct substances, each existing independently. Even though they are united in the human person, one can exist without the other. This is the foundation of substance dualism. Yet, Descartes also insisted that mind and body interact in human beings. The mind can cause bodily movements. I decide to raise my arm rises. And the body can cause mental experiences. Fire touches my finger, I feel pain. This causal interaction is central to Descartes' view of human nature. He writes, "Although I consider my body as something that exists, even if I do not think of it, I find that I am closely joined to it and, as it were, intermingled with it, so that I and the body form a unit." Sixth meditation. In other words, a human being is a mind-body unity, despite the metaphysical distinction. But here arises the major philosophical problem. How can an immaterial mind cause physical movement? And how can physical events affect an immaterial mind? This is the interaction problem, often summarized as follows. If the mind is completely non-physical and matter is completely physical, extended, divisible, and subject to motion, then how can something that takes up no space and cannot be divided or moved by impact, influence, or be influenced by something that does? As the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy puts it, how can the movement of the animal spirits bring about the existence of a sensory idea when the mind is incapable of receiving modes of motion given its non-extended nature? In other words, if the body operates on a physical level and the mind on a non-physical one, how can causal influence transfer between these two realms? This difficulty also challenges the independence of the immaterial substance. The correlation between mental events, like pain or intention, and brain processes suggests some form of dependence or interaction that Descartes never fully explained. Descartes' attempted solution, the pineal gland. Descartes tried to solve the problem, though he admitted it was difficult. He proposed that the point of contact between mind and body was the pineal gland, located deep in the center of the brain. In a letter to Princess Elizabeth of the Palatinate, he explained that although the mind is not extended or spatially located, it can direct the flow of animal spirits, a kind of very fine fluid or particles, through the pineal gland, which in turn move the body. He wrote, "The movements of the animal spirits are regulated by the inner judge, which is the soul. And this judge resides in that point, which seems to me to be the only one in the brain, the pineal gland." However, this idea quickly faced serious criticism. As one essay summarizes, the interaction problem asks how mind and body can causally interact given their heterogeneous natures. The objections were numerous. If the mind has no extension or surface, how can it touch or move the body? If the body operates by mechanical laws, how can a non-physical mind enter that chain of causation without breaking those laws? If causation goes both ways, from mind to body and body to mind, then some connecting mechanism must exist, but Descartes offered no convincing explanation beyond the pineal gland. This exposed a fundamental tension in Cartesian dualism. It claims that mind and body are completely distinct, yet also that they causally interact, an apparent contradiction. As the Stanford Encyclopedia notes, even Descartes acknowledged that the completely different natures of mind and body seem to render their causal interaction impossible. Another commentator calls it a mystery that still haunts philosophy today. In short, the mind-body problem remains unresolved because it requires explaining how something non-spatial and indivisible, the mind, can affect something spatial and divisible, the body, without violating the laws of physics or logic. Why the pineal gland? After asserting that mind and body are separate substances, the immaterial mind that thinks and the physical body that occupies space, Descartes needed a place for their interaction. He chose the pineal gland, referring to it as the principal seat of the soul in Treatise on Man and the Passions of the Soul. He chose it for three main reasons. It is unique, unlike most brain structures that come in pairs. and the soul seemed to him something unitary. It sits at the center of the brain, between the hemispheres, where sensory information converges. It appeared to control the flow of animal spirits, which he believed moved through the nerves to operate the body. In Descartes' model, when an external stimulus, like heat, affects the senses, the impression travels as animal spirits through the nerves to the brain's ventricles, reaching the pineal gland. There, the soul perceives or decides, and in turn, redirects the flow of animal spirits back through the nerves to produce movement. The pineal gland acts like a valve or switchboard, the physical site where the immaterial and the material meet. Criticisms and limitations. Despite its ingenuity, the pineal hypothesis was quickly criticized, scientifically and philosophically. 1. Anatomical inaccuracy. Even in Descartes' time, many of his anatomical claims were questionable. He believed the gland was uniquely human, it's not, and thought it was supplied mainly by arteries carrying animal spirits. It's mostly surrounded by veins. His physiology did not match reality. 2. Logical inconsistency. If the soul is not extended and cannot occupy space, how can it act upon a spatial organ? As one modern analysis puts it, this means that the clear and distinct ideas of mind and body as mutually exclusive natures must be false in order for mind-body causal interaction to occur. In other words, Descartes' own definitions make such interaction impossible without contradiction. 3. Arbitrary mechanism. Critics noted that the choice of the pineal gland was largely arbitrary. It simply relocated the problem without solving it. As one MIT reader commentary says, his proposal that mind and body interact through the pineal gland is a non-starter. 4. Incomplete explanation of consciousness. Even if the pineal could serve as a contact point, the theory says nothing about how the mind represents meaning, experiences awareness, or possesses intentionality. It offers location, not explanation. Why it still matters. Despite its flaws, Descartes' pineal hypothesis remains important. It was one of the first systematic attempts to explain mind-body interaction within a modern philosophical framework. It showed that Descartes took the problem of causation seriously and didn't simply ignore it. It set the stage for centuries of debate about consciousness, the brain, and the relationship between mind and matter. Debates that continue in neuroscience and philosophy of mind today. The pineal gland became a symbol, not of anatomical truth, but of the philosophical struggle to understand how thought and matter connect. The broader legacy. Descartes' idea revealed that simply distinguishing mind and body doesn't solve the problem. It creates it. Attempts to preserve strict dualism soon faced both scientific and logical obstacles. This led to new theories. Parallelism. Mind and body do not interact but run in perfect correspondence. Occasionalism. God directly coordinates their relationship. Materialism or emergent monism. Mental phenomena arise from physical processes. In today's philosophy of mind, the same question persists in new forms. Where and how does the mind act on the brain? The issues of consciousness, free will, and personal identity all stem from this early Cartesian dilemma. Despite the criticisms, Descartes never abandoned his core idea. The human being is a unity of soul and body, and their interaction is real. The pineal gland, in this sense, represents his attempt to preserve that unity without erasing their difference. It symbolizes both the brilliance and the limits of his system. A creative but flawed effort to bridge the gap between the thinking mind and the mechanical body. Ultimately, Descartes' pineal hypothesis is not just a biological claim, it is a philosophical icon of the human condition, a mind that thinks, a body that acts, and the enduring mystery of how the two are joined. As Descartes developed his method, questioning everything, rebuilding knowledge from the ground up with, "I think, therefore I am," and seeking a firm foundation for certainty, he realized he couldn't just suspend all judgment and live without moral direction. He needed a way to act while still searching for truth. This led to what he called a provisional morality, morale par provision, a practical code to live by while his philosophy was still under construction. Though often overlooked, this part of his thought reveals how closely linked Descartes saw knowledge, daily life, and ethics. In Discourse on Method, 1637, Part 3, he explains that while seeking to judge correctly and guide his reason properly, he needed to adopt a temporary moral code made of 3 or 4 maxims to allow him to live as happily as possible, even before achieving full certainty. He understood that radical doubt leaves a person suspended between beliefs, unable to act. So this provisional morality served as a bridge, a way to keep living, acting, and deciding while reason and science completed their work. Descartes outlines 4 guiding principles. Follow the laws and customs of one's country and religion. Until ultimate truth is reached, it's wise to live according to the rules and morals recognized by the community. Choose the most moderate opinions and avoid extremes. Always take the middle road. Be prudent, cautious, and reasonable rather than impulsive or dogmatic. Change your desires rather than the world. Focus on what's within your control. Accept what isn't, and find freedom in mastering yourself. Pursue a consistent occupation that uses reason. For Descartes, that meant dedicating his life to seeking truth and knowledge through rational inquiry. These principles form the core of his provisional morality. Not a complete ethical system, but a practical guide for life during uncertainty. The nature of Descartes' provisional morality. Temporary. It applies only while certainty is being sought. Once solid knowledge is achieved, it may be refined. Practical. It's not about abstract virtues, but about how to live day by day amid uncertainty. Rational. Even as a temporary code, it follows the method, valuing clarity, reflection, and self-control. Autonomous. Each person must take responsibility for their choices, guided by reason, not blind tradition. Humble. Descartes admitted moral knowledge isn't as clear as mathematical truth. It requires prudence. This provisional morality connects directly to his epistemology. When you doubt everything, your senses, culture, even mathematics, how do you keep living? Descartes' answer was to act according to these simple rules so that life and inquiry could continue. Without them, complete doubt would lead to paralysis. Thus, the moral code bridges theory and practice. It allows a person to live with integrity, moderation, and consistency while truth is still being built. For Descartes, the ultimate goal of human life, though not yet fully formalized at this stage, lies in using reason well, attaining wisdom, inner peace, and freedom. His morality points toward this higher good, not pleasure or wealth, but self-mastery and rational harmony. He distinguishes between what's in our control, reason, will, and what isn't, fortune, external goods. Virtue means acting well within our limits, not chasing what we can't control. This idea of self-control and inner freedom reflects Stoic influence. Happiness, then, doesn't depend on possessions or luck. It's living rationally, with calm and balance. Challenges and modern relevance critics have noted some limitations. As a temporary morality, it might feel unstable. Can a life be guided indefinitely by something provisional? It risks relativism, since it relies on social customs rather than certain truths. Descartes never clearly described the transition from provisional morality to a final, complete ethics. By linking morality too closely to knowledge, it could make virtue seem dependent on intellectual achievement. Still, Descartes' moral code carries lessons for today. It joins rational reflection with responsible action. Thinking and acting go hand in hand. It values moderation, self-discipline, and inner freedom, ideas echoed in modern mindfulness and self-development. It teaches how to live well even amid uncertainty, a timeless lesson for those seeking truth in a changing world. It reminds us that ethics need not wait for perfect knowledge. We can live wisely now, guided by reason and integrity. His provisional morality shows that ethics isn't just a list of external rules. It's part of being human, of thinking and seeking truth. Even when knowledge is uncertain, we must still act, and act well. Descartes offers a rational, humble framework for doing just that. The broader scope of Cartesian ethics. While Descartes never wrote a full ethical treatise, he often discussed what makes life good. For him, the supreme good, summum bonum, is virtue, a steady and firm will to use reason correctly, as the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy summarizes. The supreme good consists in virtue, which is a firm and constant resolution to use the will well. Virtue presupposes knowledge of metaphysics and natural philosophy. Thus, true moral action depends on understanding ourselves, God, and the world. To use reason well is both an intellectual and moral task. Reason governs the will, moderates passions, and directs actions. Acting rationally is living virtuously. Descartes saw three results of this rational life. Wisdom, the search not just for facts, but for deep understanding of life, mind, and the universe. Inner peace, calmness of mind, free from confusion and uncontrolled passions. Freedom, not the freedom to do whatever one wants, but the freedom that comes from reason, the ability to choose what is true and good. The good life, then, is a life of reason, clarity, and conscious choice. According to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, Descartes' ethics is crowned by a principle of moral universalism. In virtue of their free will, all human beings have the same moral status and deserve equal moral respect. This means moral worth comes not from tradition or status, but from our shared rational freedom. The ethical life is guided not by external authority, but by the inner light of reason. Happiness, for Descartes, is the contentment of mind that results from virtue. It doesn't depend on wealth, fame, or fortune, but on the peace of a disciplined, thoughtful soul. In this, he follows the Stoic idea that true freedom is inner mastery. Practically speaking, Descartes' ethics calls for knowing oneself, what you are, what you can control, and what you can't. Accepting limits, understanding that much of the external world is beyond your power. Directing desires and passions with reason, exercising will firmly, assenting only to what is clearly known to be good and true. Acting with consistency, moderation, and independence from material goods. In the end, Descartes' ethics is not about rigid moral rules, but about how to live well according to reason. The true good lies within us, in thought, choice, and the inner order of the mind. His ethics is deeply connected to his metaphysics. Belief in God, the immortal soul, and human freedom gives reason its moral foundation. With these, the person can live confidently, trusting that the world has order and that reason can guide life toward peace and virtue. In a world full of uncertainty, Descartes' vision still resonates. It teaches that happiness and virtue come not from external things, but from reason, self-mastery, and inner freedom. To live well is to think clearly, act steadily, and follow reason. The ultimate good is not wealth or pleasure, but a calm and wise mind, a will aligned with truth. Even though his ethics is less systematic than his metaphysics, it remains a powerful invitation. Live with clarity, think with discipline, act with constancy, and in doing so, be free. From the moment Descartes decided to ground philosophy on human reason rather than tradition, beginning with his famous I think, he also made a stylistic choice that reflected this new beginning. He abandoned, at least in part, Latin, the language monopolized by scholars, and began writing in French, his native tongue. This was not just a stylistic detail, but a symbolic act, an effort to make philosophy more open and accessible to anyone capable of thinking, not just those trained in scholastic Latin. In 1637, Descartes published the Discourse on Method, Discours de la méthode pour bien conduire sa raison, et chercher la vérité dans les sciences, in French. In this semi-autobiographical philosophical work, he narrates his intellectual journey, his doubts, and his quest for truth. He presents his famous 4 rules for guiding reason in a language that any educated reader could follow. The tone is clear, personal, and conversational, not meant just to teach philosophy, but to invite readers to think for themselves. His choice to write in French aimed to reach a broader audience than Latin ever could. This stylistic decision marks a turning point. The modern philosopher stops writing only for an elite of scholars and begins speaking to anyone capable of using common sense and reason. It fits perfectly with Descartes' larger project, to elevate the thinking subject as something universal. His 4 major works. Let's look at each of Descartes' main works, their purpose, style, and significance in the context of this philosophical renewal. 1. Discourse on Method, 1637. Already mentioned, this work stands out for being written in French with the intention of reaching a wider audience. It mixes personal storytelling, how Descartes left traditional studies, travelled and learned through doubt, with an explanation of his method, the rules of evidence, analysis, synthesis, and enumeration. He also discusses his provisional morality, the existence of God, the soul, and the physical world. Compared to the dense scholastic treatises of his time, the discourse feels light, direct, and readable. Publishing it in French made it not only a philosophical treatise, but also a public statement. Knowledge should be modernized and shared. 2. Meditations on First Philosophy, 1641. Written in Latin, Meditationes de Prima Philosophia. This is Descartes' most famous work in academic philosophy. It develops the full structure of his system: methodical doubt, the cogito, proofs of God's existence, the mind-body distinction, and the foundation of knowledge. Its style is more formal and precise than the discourse, written for an academic audience. Still, the discourse prepared the ground by showing that philosophical reflection could be shared in plain language before being developed in more technical form. 3. Principles of Philosophy, 1644. Written in Latin, Principia Philosophiae, and later translated into French, this book works as a systematic manual summarizing Descartes' thought, from metaphysics to mechanistic physics, cosmology, and anthropology. It organizes what had been developed in the Meditations and Discourse into a structured, almost textbook-like system. His ambition here was pedagogical, to reform university philosophy and replace the old Aristotelian model. The tone is methodical and academic, but its later translation into French reinforces the idea that modern philosophy should reach beyond the scholarly elite. 4. The Passions of the Soul, 1649. In this later work, Descartes turns his attention to human experience, emotion, morality, and the mind-body relationship. He examines how the passions arise, how reason can govern them, and how the inner life works. Here he returns to French, adopting a tone that blends philosophy, early psychology, and physiology. This work is not aimed only at abstract philosophers, but at living, feeling people. The use of the vernacular emphasizes that philosophy, for Descartes, belongs to life itself. It's about understanding how we think, feel, and act. The impact of writing in the vernacular. Descartes' decision to write in his native French had lasting consequences. Accessibility. By using French in the Discourse and Passions of the Soul, he brought philosophy closer to ordinary readers, not just scholars. This helped democratize thought, reflecting his belief that every rational being can engage in philosophy. Authenticity. Writing in his own language made his voice more personal. He presents himself not as an authority above others, but as a fellow thinker. I who doubted, I who travelled, I who began again. This personal tone makes his philosophy more human and inspiring. A break with tradition. By moving away from Latin, Descartes symbolically ended the era when philosophy belonged only to academic elites. He wanted reason and clarity to be part of everyone's experience, a double audience. Writing both in Latin and in French allowed him to reach two groups, the scholarly world and the broader educated public. In doing so, he helped philosophy expand its reach beyond the university walls. Educational influence. His clear style and narrative approach made his ideas easier to understand and teach. This likely explains why Descartes' works are still so widely read today. His philosophy wasn't just deep, but readable, the connection between style and substance. We can't separate what Descartes said from how he said it. His use of the vernacular, his personal tone, and his narrative clarity were all part of the philosophical revolution he started. The message itself carries two levels. It is possible to think for yourself. Here's how. And you, reader, can do it too. His four main works form a clear sequence. Discourse on Method, the beginning, the invitation. Meditations, the foundation and demonstration. Principles of philosophy, the systematization. Passions of the soul, the return to human experience. Together, they tell a story. The philosopher who doubts, rebuilds, constructs a system, and finally comes back to life itself, to the passions, the mind, and the heart. The style mirrors this journey. Plain language, a reflective tone, an open invitation to think. For a modern audience, including those on platforms like YouTube, this is a valuable lesson. Philosophy doesn't have to be inaccessible. Clarity, storytelling, and emotional tone are not enemies of deep thought. They're part of it. Descartes' approach shows that explaining philosophy in simple, engaging language doesn't weaken it. It strengthens it. His writing bridges knowledge and life, intellect and emotion, reason and accessibility. In short, Descartes' choice to write partly in his native language marked a decisive turning point in the history of philosophy. It expressed his desire to make thinking universal, to bring reason closer to people and invite them to participate in it. His four main works, Discourse on Method, Meditations on First Philosophy, Principles of Philosophy, and Passions of the Soul, form a complete philosophical journey that combines method, certainty, system, and lived experience. If modern philosophy begins with Descartes, part of its power lies in how he wrote. Clearly, personally, and for everyone willing to think. And that legacy lives on. Every time someone asks, "Why should I think? How can I know?" Or, "How should I live?" They are retracing the very path Descartes first opened. Imagine a time when philosophy was like a fortress, closed off from ordinary people. Ideas circulated only within university walls, written in Latin and wrapped in the traditions of scholasticism. Aristotle still ruled as the unquestioned authority, and thinking differently was often seen as rebellion, or even heresy. It was in this world that a restless mind emerged, determined to break centuries of intellectual dependence. René Descartes. More than a philosopher, Descartes was a turning point. His boldness wasn't just in his ideas, but in his attitude toward knowledge itself. He placed himself at the center, not as a believer, but as a thinker who doubts, questions, and starts over from zero. And with that simple but radical gesture, he founded what we now call modern philosophy. When Descartes published Discourse on Method in 1637, the intellectual world was still bound by medieval frameworks. Theology dominated, and philosophy mainly served to defend religious dogma. But Descartes dared to say, "Let's doubt everything. Anything that isn't absolutely certain must be set aside. Only then can we build, step by step, a solid foundation for knowledge based on reason." That act of radical doubt, which seems simple today, was revolutionary. It shifted the center of philosophy. Instead of relying on ancient authorities, Descartes put human reason at the heart of inquiry. He believed that every person, using reason methodically, could reach truth. That idea was deeply liberating. That's why he's called the father of modern philosophy, not just because he proposed new ideas, but because he changed how philosophy was done. He taught us to begin with the subject, with consciousness itself, with what is clear and distinct, what cannot be denied. The Cogito, "I think, therefore I am," is more than a famous phrase. It's a declaration of independence. For the first time, the self became the foundation of truth, not God, not tradition, not the senses, but thought itself. If I am thinking, then I exist. This idea marked the birth of the modern subject, a being who thinks, chooses, and seeks truth for itself. That shift influenced an entire generation of thinkers who came after him. 17th century Europe was undergoing massive change. Science was rising with Galileo, Kepler, and Newton. The Reformation had shaken the Church's authority. Politics, art, and religion were all in transformation. Amid this crisis and opportunity, Descartes offered a path forward: reason as a guide. He proposed that through method and clarity, the world could be understood. The universe was no longer a mysterious creation beyond comprehension. It became a rational system, a kind of machine that could be studied and described. This new way of thinking influenced not only philosophers, but also scientists, mathematicians, theologians, and even political thinkers. The belief that solid knowledge could be built step by step on rational foundations became a defining feature of the modern world. The rationalist legacy. Descartes' influence didn't end with his lifetime. The echo of his ideas can be heard in Spinoza, Leibniz, and Kant, three giants of modern philosophy. Spinoza started from Descartes' framework to build his own ethical and metaphysical system. While rejecting Descartes' dualism, believing instead that everything is one substance, God or nature, Spinoza still shared Descartes' faith in reason as a path to freedom. Leibniz, another rationalist, developed the idea that the world is made of monads, rational entities that reflect the universe. Like Descartes, he believed reason could lead to harmony and ultimate truth, even though he disagreed with parts of Descartes' system. Kant, in the 18th century, created a brilliant synthesis of Cartesian rationalism and British empiricism. He acknowledged that Descartes was the first to make the thinking subject the foundation of knowledge, and his own critique of pure reason was, in many ways, a response to Descartes' project. All of them shared one core conviction: reason is the starting point. That is Descartes' true legacy. He didn't give us all the answers, but he showed us how to begin searching for them on our own. With Descartes, philosophy became more independent, critical, and methodical. Doubt became a tool for clarity. Reason became its own light, no longer subordinated to faith. Of course, Descartes wasn't alone. Other thinkers of his era also sought new paths. But he was the one who had the courage to begin from nothing, to rebuild thought from its foundations. That's why history remembers him as the father of modern philosophy. If philosophy today is a space for questioning, reflection, and inquiry, much of that freedom began with Descartes. He didn't give us a closed system but a starting point, the thinking self, the one who questions and seeks. Even now, when we talk about consciousness, intelligence, science, or freedom, we're still in dialogue with Descartes. His legacy remains alive, and like any great legacy, it has also been challenged. The cracks in the system. If Descartes was the great architect of modern philosophy, his system also left deep cracks, especially in his dualism, the split between mind, res cogitans, and body, res extensa. What seemed to him an elegant solution, separating thought from matter to preserve the certainty of the thinking self, became one of philosophy's greatest puzzles. How could two substances so completely different ever interact? How could something immaterial like the mind move or be moved by something physical like the body? This unresolved tension became the famous mind-body problem, sometimes described as the ghost in the machine. Descartes had suggested that the interaction took place in the pineal gland in the brain, but that explanation was quickly dismissed as inadequate. It sounded like an anatomical guess, not a philosophical solution. The question persisted: if mind and body are so different, how can they affect each other at all? The empiricist critique. The first major attack came from the British empiricists, John Locke and David Hume. They argued that Descartes had overestimated reason and underestimated experience. Locke rejected the idea of innate ideas, claiming instead that the human mind is a tabula rasa, a blank slate. Knowledge, he said, comes entirely from experience, from sensations and reflections shaped by contact with the world. For him, Mind and body weren't two separate realms, but parts of a continuous process of perception. Hume went even further. He questioned whether there even is a stable self, like Descartes claimed. When we look within, Hume said, we don't find a single thinking substance, only a constant stream of perceptions, sensations, and memory. In his words, the self is just a bundle of experiences, always changing. For the empiricists, then, Descartes' Cogito collapses. There is no clear, permanent I separate from experience. Reason alone cannot build the foundation of knowledge. It must always be grounded in what we actually perceive. The idealist response. In the late 18th century, Immanuel Kant offered a more sophisticated response. He didn't reject reason as the empiricists did, but he also didn't accept Descartes' strict separation between mind and body. For Kant, the mind isn't a substance. It's an active structure that organizes experience. The I isn't a thing but a function of consciousness, a unifying center that makes experience possible. So instead of, I think, therefore I am, Kant asks, how is knowledge itself possible? For him, mind and world aren't separate substances. They're interdependent poles of one and the same process of knowing. Hegel pushed this even further. He accused Descartes of creating an abstract, isolated subject, a consciousness detached from history and society. Hegel's view was the opposite. Consciousness is historical, social, and dialectical. The self is not born in isolation, but through its interaction with others and with the world. The mind is not a static substance, it's an evolving process. Both Kant and Hegel thus moved beyond Cartesian dualism, redefining the mind not as a thinking thing, but as a living relational activity. The phenomenological critique. In the 20th century, a new wave of thinkers, the phenomenologists, delivered perhaps the strongest critique of Descartes' dualism. For them, Descartes' great mistake was to split mind and body. Real experience shows that we are a unity of both, not a mind trapped in a body, but a living being who perceives and acts through the body itself. Edmund Husserl, the founder of phenomenology, began somewhat like Descartes, with the suspension of judgment and the search for certainty. But he soon diverged, arguing that all consciousness is intentional. It is always directed towards something. The mind is never isolated. It's always in relation to the world. Maurice Merleau-Ponty delivered the most decisive blow with his concept of the lived body, corp propria. He argued that we are not minds inside bodies, but embodied beings, bodies that think, feel, and act. The mind isn't above the body. It is the body in action. He writes, I am not a being of thoughts who has a body. I am a body that can think. In other words, there is no separation between mind and body. They are one and the same reality, experienced from within. Why the debate still matters. Despite centuries of criticism, Descartes' questions remain alive. The mind-body problem continues to shape discussions in philosophy, neuroscience, psychology, and artificial intelligence. How does consciousness arise? How does the brain produce thought, feeling, and language? Are we purely physical beings, or is there something beyond matter? Even when we criticize Descartes, we're still speaking his language. The modern debate between materialism and dualism is, in many ways, a continuation of his legacy. The critiques of Descartes don't erase him. They refine and expand his project. From the empiricists, we learn to value experience. From the idealists, we learn to understand reason's structure. From the phenomenologists, we rediscovered the living body as the core of human experience. Descartes remains, not as an infallible authority, but as the one who had the courage to begin from nothing and ask the hardest questions. His errors, if they were errors, were the necessary price of trying to build absolute knowledge in a world that was itself being reinvented. And that is his greatest legacy. The courage to doubt, to begin again, and to make thinking itself the foundation of human freedom. Thank you so much for watching all the way through. If this video helped you understand more about the legacy and the criticisms of René Descartes' philosophy, Don't forget to like the video. It really supports the channel and keeps us motivated to keep creating quality content for you. Subscribe if you haven't already and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss the next videos. And of course, share this with friends who also enjoy philosophy or are studying for exams like college entrance tests or humanities courses. And tell me in the comments, do you believe the mind and body are truly separate, as Descartes claimed? Or do you see it differently? Your opinion is always welcome. It helps create great discussions for future videos. And if you want to dive even deeper into philosophy, don't leave just yet. We have videos about Kant, Spinoza, Aristotle, Nietzsche, and many more. See you in the next video.